Greta Christina, noted author, blogger, and sometimes angry activist. We'll talk about the LGBT movement, its histories, stumbles, victories, and what we can learn from the continuing fight to ensure equal rights for everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation. Thank you, and without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Greta Christina.
And to all of you for being here today. And since we have limited time, I'm just going to get right to it. I'm talking about what the atheist movement can learn from the history of the LGBT movement. And you know, the atheist movement is already modeling ourselves in many ways on the LGBT movement, and we should do that. You know, the parallels between the two movements are sometimes kind of eerie. Because I think the LGBT movement is roughly 35 years ahead of the atheist movement. I think the atheist movement is about where the LGBT movement was in the kind of the early days of the very visible, vocal, activist movement shortly after the Stonewall riots. I think we have a unique chance to learn from that movement, both from its successes and from its failures. A really quick question before I move on. Who here knows about the Stonewall riots? Okay, a good number of you do, some of you don't. For those of you who don't, the Stonewall riots happened in June of 1969, and they're generally considered what sparked the modern LGBT movement. And in June of 1969 in New York City, the police were raiding gay bars and arresting people like they've been doing, you know, hundreds of times for decades. But at this particular time, in June of 1969, at a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn, the gay people fought back. And when I say they fought back, I don't mean that they wrote angry letters to the editors and marched with picket signs. I mean that they set fire to garbage cans and threw rocks at cops. The Stonewall riots were riots. And if anybody tells you that confrontationalism is not an effective form of social change, I encourage you to read that history, because the Stonewall riots are, in fact, they're generally considered what sparked the modern LGBT movement. It's something of an oversimplification. There had been a gay rights movement before Stonewall. But after Stonewall, the gay movement became much more visible, much more vocal, much more activist, and very much less apologetic. Very much like the current atheist movement. You know, obviously there was an atheist movement long before the so-called new atheism. But it's undeniable that something really big and something new has been happening in atheism in the last few years. We've become more visible, more vocal, better organized, more activist, and yay, much less apologetic. And the movement has really changed dramatically, and it's not going to be the same. And so that's what I mean when I say that the atheist movement is about 35 years behind the gay movement, or about where the gay movement was in the years shortly after Stonewall. And that's why I think we have such a rare opportunity to learn from the history of that movement. So what can we learn from the history of that movement? I'm so glad you asked. Probably the single most important thing that we can learn from the history of the LGBT movement is to encourage visibility and coming out, and to make atheism a safe place to come out into. Very early in the LGBT movement, it became clear that coming out is the single most powerful political act that gay people can take. Very consistently, polls show that the single factor that's most predictive of whether people support gay rights is whether they know a gay person, or more accurately, whether they know that they know a gay person. And this is very much a lesson that the atheist movement has been taking to heart with the OUT campaign, with the billboard and bus ad campaigns. You know, we have been doing an excellent job with visibility, and it's been effective. We've gone from 0 to 60 in terms of being on the general public's radar. You know, nobody was talking about atheism except atheists, you know, 20 years ago, 10, 20 years ago. And now it is on everybody's radar. It's on the news, it's, you know, being discussed in op-ed columns, at water coolers, at dinner tables, all around the country. And as a result of that, largely as a result of that, more atheists are coming out every day. Visibility has this great snowball effect. But I think that we're doing a less consistent job of making the atheist movement a safe place to come out into. And I think this is, again, something we can learn from the history of the LGBT movement. In the post-Stonewall days of that movement, there was this huge blossoming of atheist community centers, bookstores, you know, coffee houses, political groups, bars, you know, bowling leagues, you know, all that stuff. Coming out as queer often meant leaving behind your family and your friends. And so queers formed our own social support networks to replace the ones that we have left. And the atheist movement has not been as strong about this. Online, we've been awesome. I sometimes think, where would the gay movement be now if we had the internet in 1970? So we've really done a great job of providing online communities, but in the flesh, we haven't done as good a job of providing those in-the-flesh support networks that, that replace the churches and the synagogues and the mosques and the covens and so on. And I think we can really learn from the LGBT movement to remember the difficulty of coming out and to have sympathy and compassion for people who are having a hard time with that. We have to remember that when we encourage people to rethink religion and embrace atheism, we're actually asking a lot. We're not just asking people to completely reshape their entire philosophical foundation of their life. We are asking that, but we're also asking them, in many cases, to alienate their friends and their family and community. And I would really like to see us do a lot better job at providing community to replace that. Now, that's not to say that we're not doing that. I think that we are, and we're doing a better job of it in recent years. And actually, I think some of the groups that have been doing the best job have been student groups. There's kind of this thing that people say, it's like the student atheist movement, they're the future of the movement. There's something Liz Liddell, who's a campus organizer for the Secular Student Alliance, says is, yes, students are the future of the movement. Students are also the present of this movement. Students are doing a huge amount of this on the ground community building in student groups. And students are, that's where it's really important that that be done, because colleges and universities are where people do a lot of questioning of religion. It's where people start to let go of their religious beliefs. So I would really like to encourage the leaders of these student groups to continue that work after you leave school. The Secular Student Alliance has an alumni program, get in touch with them. And I would really like to encourage people who aren't students to partner with the student groups and to give them support. And really, the fact that student atheist groups are blossoming around the country, I mean, again, talk to August at the Secular Student Alliance table. There are, I believe, over 300 groups, and that's like practically, I think that's like doubled in just a couple of years. And the fact that the rates of atheism are so much higher among young people than they are among older people, that is one of the most encouraging signs of this movement. And I think those of us who aren't students can do a lot to help foster that movement and help make it flourish among students. Just work with student groups, co-sponsor events, help provide some mentoring and continuity, throw a few dollars their way, it really makes a difference. Okay, so there's another lesson that I think atheists can learn from the LGBT movement, and this is one that it took the queer movement a little while to learn, and that we're still fighting over. And that's to let firebrands be firebrands, and let diplomats be diplomats. We need to recognize that not all activists pursue activism in the same way. We need to recognize that using both more confrontational and more diplomatic approaches to activism, that makes us a stronger movement. And that both of these approaches used together, synergistically and cooperatively, is much more powerful than either approach used by itself. Now, again, to some extent, the LGBT movement is still learning this lesson. We're still hashing out these fights, but we've become much better about it, and as a result, our movement has become stronger. And here's an example. In the queer activist movement of the 80s and 90s, the really loud, angry street activist groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation, they used to accuse the more mild-mannered lobbying groups of, assimilationism and excessive compromise and being big sellouts. And of course, the mild-mannered groups would often accuse the street activists of being overly idealistic and alienating potential allies and making their own jobs harder, and is all this seeming really familiar to everybody here. But when we look at the years in retrospect, it becomes clear that both methods together were far more effective than either method would have been by itself. And part of this is just that different methods of activism speak to different people. Some people really respond to a quiet, patient voice, and some people really respond to a loud, passionate cry for justice. And the good cop, bad cop dynamic should not be underestimated. There's a reason cops use it. It works. And again, in the queer movement of the 80s and 90s, how this worked was that the angry street activists, they got attention, they got on the news, they raised this general visibility and awareness of their issues, and then the polite negotiators could raise a more kind of calm, nuanced version of hell. because people were already familiar with the issues, because they'd already seen it on the news, because they'd seen, ACT UP, lying in the streets, painting outlines of dead bodies in the streets. It's talking about, screaming about how many people were dying. And also, when the street activists presented more extreme hardline demands, that made the polite negotiators seem more reasonable by comparison. They could say, oh, well, yeah, okay, active accreditation, they go a little far, but what about this? There's this common idea in politics called moving the center, which is that when you have extremists presenting a very, hardline perspective, that moves what's considered to be the moderate position. And where we've seen that in the gay movement is with the fight for same-sex marriage. I mean, this is a fight that's been going on for a few years. It's a long fight. It's probably going to take many more years before we get to where we need to be. But one of the results of that fight has been that civil unions and domestic partnerships has become the moderate position. It's even the conservative one. A lot of even, like Republicans are saying, well, okay, sure, civil unions and domestic partnerships, that's fine. That's not unfair. There's just marriage we don't want. They weren't saying that 20 years ago. And it's because we've moved the window that the moderate position has taken hold. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't debate our tactical differences. On any given issue, it's worth debating whether a more, hardline, firebrand, confrontational approach is more effective or more diplomatic approach is effective in that particular case. But I would really like us to stop treating these debates as if they were these huge questions of morality and character that have to be decided once and for all, for everybody, forever. One of the basic things is that we do what we're inspired to do, and we do what we're good at. Some of us are good at passionate confrontational idealism, and some of us are good at polite empathy and sympathy with our opponents, and some of us are good at melding those approaches. So the diplomatic atheists need to stop shutting up the firebrands and need to stop, telling them, oh, you're alienating people and you're making your job harder. And the firebrand atheists need to stop accusing the diplomats of being wusses. And I want to close with one more lesson that the atheist movement can learn from the LGBT movement. I actually have a lot more, but I have limited time today. We can talk about it more on the panel. But this is a very important lesson that I really want to spend some time on today. And it's a lesson that atheists can learn not from the successes of the LGBT movement, but from one of our biggest failures. And it's a failure that has come back to bite us in the ass time and time again. And that's that atheists need to work now on making our movement and making our communities more inclusive and more welcoming of women and of people of color and of other marginalized groups such as working class people, disabled people, trans people, and so on. And by now, I mean now. Actually, what we need to do is invent a time machine, go back in time, and start working on this 10 years ago. But we can't do that, so we really need to start working on this now. Before we get set into patterns and vicious circles and self-fulfilling prophecies that 10 or 20 years from now are going to be really hard to fix. So what can atheists learn about this from the LGBT movement? The LGBT movement screwed this up. And we screwed it up badly. The early 70s post-Stonewall LGBT movement was very much dominated by gay white men. The most prominent, iconic figures in that movement were very much gay white men. Most of the organizations were led by gay white men, and these gay white male leaders had some seriously screwed up stuff going on about gender and race. I'm mostly going to talk about gender and race, by the way, today, but it does apply to other forms of marginalization. And we are paying for that today. Relations between lesbians and gay men, between white queers and queers of color are often very strained at best. The conversations in our movement about race and gender, they take place in this minefield, this decades-old minefield of bitterness and rancor where nothing anybody says is right. And after decades, we still have this really unfortunate ingrained tendency to put gay white men front and center as the most iconic representatives of our movement. And this makes it hard on everybody in the LGBT movement. Everybody, men and women, white and people of color, everybody has a hard time with this. It creates rifts that make our community weaker. And it affects negatively our ability to create social change. I mean, a really good example of that is the LGBT movement has a very profoundly impaired ability to shift homophobic attitudes in the Black communities, because Black people can say entirely with justice that the LGBT movement has not dealt with its racism and doesn't really care that much about Black people. So why should we work on, why should we work on your issues? And sort of failing to recognize, hey, actually we have a lot of issues in common, and there's a lot of gay Black people who are feeling outcast by both groups. We screwed this up. We continue to screw this up. We are paying for our screw-ups. Atheism has a chance to not do that. And so what I want to talk about is some of the specific things that atheist groups sometimes do to become exclusionary without intending to. And I want to talk about some of the specific strategies that we can take to make the situation better. And again, these are all ideas taken from other places, the history of the LGBT movement. Okay, so first of all, how do these unfortunate trends for a movement to become dominated by white men, how do they get ingrained? How do they get there in the first place? First of all, we have unconscious bias. I think we're all familiar, as atheists and skeptics, we're all familiar with cognitive bias, we're all familiar with the fact that we have unconscious ideas driving us that we're not always aware of, because they're unconscious. And this is true of racism and sexism as well. Even with the best of conscious intentions, people tend to be more comfortable and more trusting with people who they see as being like them. This has been well and thoroughly documented, this is not controversial. And so if a movement starts out mostly being made up of and led by white men, and there's no conscious, proactive attempt to seek out and welcome women and people of color, that movement is going to have a very strong tendency to continue being dominated by white men. And another way that unconscious bias can work, because white men are used to being in charge and are used to being seen as authorities, figures, they often feel more comfortable stepping up to the plate when it comes to issues of visibility and leadership. I was recently talking with the organizers of a group that works to get women to run for political office, and they said something really interesting. They said that the single factor that is most effective in getting women to run for political office is having somebody ask them to do it. Women and people of color are not socialized to think of ourselves as leaders, so when a position opens up, we don't often think of ourselves as stepping up to the plate. But if somebody just asks us, if somebody just says, you would be really great, running for board president, you would be really great running for the board of supervisors, you should be great on the board of directors, this position is opening up as president of the organization, you've been in the organization for 5 years, why don't you run for that? If somebody just asks us, that goes a very long way to improving the diversity of the community. And of course, people can have racist and sexist attitudes without being aware of it. You don't have to be a torch-wielding member of the KKK or of Operation Rescue, to think and say dumb things about race and gender. And believe me, I speak from experience as somebody who has said and thought plenty of dumb things in my life. A lot of racism and sexism is not grossly overt, it's subtle, we're not always aware of it. And so I think we need to not get immediately defensive if somebody says, hey, the thing you said, that's kind of screwed up, that leaves women out. Our first reaction should not be to say, that's impossible, I'm not a sexist, therefore, we need to accept that we have unconscious attitudes and at least accept that's a remote possibility. And one of the things to be aware of about these unconscious attitudes is that even if we're not conscious of it, the people on the receiving end of it, you can bloody well believe that they're conscious of it. And it can put them off from participating in a community they might otherwise be interested in. I'm going to skip some stuff here because I think we have a time issue. There's also an issue of focus. People have a very natural, unconscious tendency, very understandable tendency to focus on issues that concern them most directly. And if a movement, however unintentionally, is primarily being led by white men, that movement is going to focus its energies on issues that primarily concern white men at the expense of issues that primarily concern women and people of color. As one example, I'll cite a tendency that I talked about earlier, and that's the tendency of the atheist movement to provide an internet community more than we provide in the flesh communities, and to put our energies there. It's a very understandable tendency. Interfaith communities are pretty easy to form. You know, you can do it sitting on the sofa in your bathrobe. It's a very understandable tendency, but it's a tendency that ignores the really powerful social bond that churches provide in the African American communities. And that neglects the isolation that many African American atheists feel when they leave those churches, and then fails to offer a replacement for them. Some very specific pragmatic examples. If our meetings and events and conferences are too expensive, if they're not near public transportation, if there's no scholarships available for people who can't afford the high prices, if there's no childcare arranged, these are very nuts and bolts pragmatic ways of placing the focus on the needs of white male atheists at the expense of the needs of women and people of color. And then we have everybody's favorite good time, self-fulfilling prophecies. Let's pretend just for a moment that the things I've been talking about earlier, the unconscious bias and focus, let's pretend that's not happening at all. Let's pretend the atheist movement is, largely, made up of and led by white men out of purely dumb, random, toss to the dice luck. Obviously I don't think that's true, but for the sake of argument, let's pretend that's true. Even if that were true, the tendency of the movement to be dominated by white men would still tend to perpetuate itself because of self-fulfilling prophecies. Remember what we talked about before. People are more comfortable with other people who say they see as being like them. And that's not just true for white men, it's true for women, it's true for people of color, it's true for working class people, it's true for transgender people, it's true for disabled people. If a movement is largely made up of white men and led by white men, and they're the most visible representatives of the movement, women and people of color are just less likely to join up, they're less likely to see the movement as being about them. Even if this tendency to be dominated by white men had happened purely by accident, it would still tend to perpetuate itself because of self-fulfilling prophecies. And of course, all of this is assuming that there's no overt sexism and racism in the atheist movement, that all of the racism and sexism in the atheist movement is unconscious and unintentional. And unfortunately, as a lot of women, especially in the atheist movement, have learned over the last year, that is really unfortunately not true. There's a lot of really overt, ugly sexism and also racism in the atheist movement. It's not all subtle. Let me tell you about the rape threats sometime. Okay, so these are some of the ways that a movement can stay largely dominated by white men, even if nobody intended it to happen that way. But here's the good news. I know everybody's ready for some good news, so I've been bragging you about how hard this is. There is some good news, which is that a lot of this is fixable. Or a lot of it is addressable. Even if we can't make it perfect, we can make it better. And it's so much easier to address this in the early stages of a movement becoming visible and vocal and activist than it is later on down the line after patterns have been established. I mean, this is one of the points that I make a lot, is as frustrating as some of these arguments we've been having in the community about race and gender have been, they actually give me a lot of hope because we're having them now. We're not having them 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And this is a lesson that the LGBT movement dearly wishes it had learned early on in the days. So how do we fix this? So let's start with the whole self-fulfilling prophecy bit. Self-fulfilling prophecies can seem beyond hope. They're self-fulfilling. How do you stop something that fulfills itself? But there are actually very practical steps that the atheist movement can take to derail this cycle, or at least to mitigate it. And very importantly, self-perpetuating cycles can be used for the power of good. Okay, so for starters, atheist organizations can make a conscious, deliberate effort to reach out to women and people of color, and to get the women and people of color they already have in their organizations into greater positions of visibility and leadership. Groups and conference organizers can make an effort to get more women and people of color as speakers, both speaking on issues of race and gender, and also just speaking on general issues having to do with atheism. Thank you again very much to Atheist Alliance America for inviting me to speak here today. Clearly, somebody was thinking about this issue when the speaker roster for this conference was put together, so thank you. Speakers bureaus can make an effort to recruit women and people of color. Leaders, organizational leaders and thought leaders, speakers, spokespeople, can make an effort to address specific concerns of women and people of color in the atheist community. Atheist groups can be sure to include women and people of color in visibility campaigns and billboard campaigns, in your videos, in your advertisements. Atheist groups can print t-shirts in women's styles. Every time I say that, all the women in the audience know what I'm talking about. And this may seem like a small point, it's like t-shirts, who cares about t-shirts? But really, if you want a perfect symbolic example of thinking that this movement should be a one-size-fits-all movement, and that size should be a size that fits men, and that women just have to adapt ourselves to uncomfortably, having t-shirts only in men's styles is a perfect symbol of that. So, and here's the thing, as these efforts take hold and as the movement becomes more inclusive, more women and people of color are going to feel more welcomed about joining. Inclusivity is also a self-perpetuating cycle. The more women and people of color you have in a movement, the more you're going to get. And the unconscious bias thing, that's not hopeless either. As we all know, cognitive biases are very stubborn, but consciousness of them can go a great way to mitigating them. One of the great things about having a more diverse community is your unconscious biases get called into question every day. Every time you have a conversation with a person of color that's an intelligent, thoughtful conversation, your unconscious bias that tells you that black people are stupid, that because you've been raised by a racist culture your whole life, gets called into question. Every time you defer to a woman in a position of leadership because she's the leader, she's the president of the organization, your unconscious bias that says women can't be leaders that you've been taught your whole life get called into question. Having a more diverse community calls your unconscious biases into question. And also, it helps because there's going to be more people around to call you on it when you're being a jerk. And people who are going to feel more comfortable calling you on it because they'll feel like they have backup. And again, this can be a self-fulfilling prophecy for good as well as for evil. The more conscious that a community gets of its biases and the more it works to overcome those unconscious biases, the more women and people of color are going to feel welcomed in that community. And the more welcome they are, the more they're going to join, and the more they're going to join, the more those unconscious biases get called into question. It's beautiful. I love this. I want to mention a couple of other specific things we can do about this before I conclude with talking about why it's so important. A really crucial one, and one that's very hard for a lot of people to get, and I will put myself into that category. When somebody brings up the subject of racism or sexism in the atheist movement, listen. Just stop talking and listen. Pay attention. Don't immediately get defensive and reflexively reject the idea out of hand. You don't necessarily have to agree with the criticism. I have seen people say, oh, that was so sexist, and I was going, actually, I don't think that was true. I don't agree with that. You don't have to agree. We have to listen. We have to think about it. We have to not just reflexively react out of defensive emotion before we decide whether the criticism is valid. There's a technique I've been using if somebody accuses me of some ism that I wasn't aware of, and I'm feeling all defensive and heated up. It's like, I'm not a bad person, how dare you say that about me? Something that I've learned to do is to say, I'm going to think about that. And that way I don't have to automatically agree, but it means that I'm not reacting out of that immediate emotional defensiveness. I say, I'm hearing what you're saying, I don't know if I agree with you, I might, let me think about that. That should be your mantra. And one last very important strategy bit before we finish up here. Those of us who are already on board, those of us who've been nodding and going, yes, yes, we get it, I'm totally on board with this. We need to keep talking about it. We need to keep it on everybody's radar. And very importantly, it's really important for a good amount of the talking about gender to be done by men, and for a good amount of the talking about race to be done by white people. And I know that can be uncomfortable. I mean, as a white person, I often feel uncomfortable talking about race because I feel like I know I have unconscious racism in me. I'm probably going to put my foot in my mouth. I'm probably going to say something stupid. And there's a part of me that just wants to let the people of color talk about it because they know more about it. That doesn't work. White people have to talk about racism and men have to talk about sexism. Here's why. I want to give an example, and this is actually a really positive example of something that I think the atheist community has, for the most part, been doing really, really well. One of the first things that my wife Ingrid and I noticed when we first started hanging out in the atheist blogosphere was that on the rare occasion when somebody in a comment thread at an atheist blog said something stupid or bigoted about gay people, straight people were all over them. Straight people dogpiled onto them and smacked them down. We didn't have to be the ones speaking out about homophobia. We could sit back, we could watch the straight people deliver the smackdown. And just by itself, and even if they sometimes got it a little bit wrong, the fact that they were doing it made us feel incredibly welcome in atheism. It made us feel like atheism was about us. And that is a huge factor in what's made me want to be as an active participant in this movement as I have been. We're not perfect about it, or especially not as good about it with trans people as we are with lesbian and gay and bisexual people. But we generally do a pretty good job with this with sexual orientation. We need to expand that into arenas of race and gender. We need to get as comfortable talking about racism and sexism as we are talking about homophobia. We need to keep it on everybody's radar. And if anybody of you out there is still wondering why this is important and why we need to make this such a focus, I urge you to talk to anybody who is seriously involved in LGBT politics, and ask them, if you could get in a time machine, if you could go back to 1970 and get the pre-Stonewall leaders of the movement to deal with their racism and sexism and to deal with race and sex in the movement, would you do that? I can guarantee you that virtually every single LGBT leader now, given that chance, would say yes, for the sweet love of Loki and all the gods in Valhalla. If we could do that, if we could send a message to the leaders of the early movement to tell them to deal with this, we would do that. And that's not just true of the LGBT movement. Every social change movement I know of has been bitten on the ass by this issue. The feminist movement was bitten on the ass by it in dealing with race and class. The civil rights movement was bitten on the ass by it dealing with sexism and homophobia. The labor movement, the environmental movement, the peace movement. Every social change movement I know has been bitten on the ass by this issue, and it dearly wishes that they had dealt with it early on. We have a chance in the atheist movement to not screw this up. We have a really unique chance to start dealing with it now, so that it's less of a problem in 10 or 20 years, and we're not wasting our time 10 or 20 or 50 years from now dealing with a situation that's gotten much worse that we can fix relatively easily, but easier than it will be in 50 years fixing it now. Let's learn from the mistakes of the LGBT movement as well as from its successes, and let's take advantage of this unique opportunity.